Election day is almost here. And it usually goes something like this.
That Americans watch the results as if they're watching the Super Bowl. By the time they go to sleep, they expect to know who the next president is going to be.
Except this time around, we most likely won't have the final results on November 3rd.
And of course, that has to do with the fact that tens of millions are going to be voting by mail-in ballots.
We also have a president who refused to commit to a peaceful transition of power.
Donald Trump can say, and he's already been sort of sowing the seeds, to say, well, if we don't have a winner by the evening of November 3rd, then the entire election has been a fraud and I've been cheated.
So what happens if the 2020 US presidential election is contested? We're going to look at a few possible scenarios and whether the US system is ready for a chaotic election. If the election is contested this year, it actually wouldn't be the first time. Since the 1800s, at least 4 presidential elections have been disputed. Fast forward to 2020. The US has a president who has repeatedly said he may not accept the election results if he loses, and mock reporters who asked him about a peaceful transition of power.
He will not give up power. Under no circumstances will he give up power. He intends to serve at least 2 more terms.
On top of this, President Trump has also suggested that the only way he would lose is if the Democrats
steal the election. Look at this crowd. The only way they can win Pennsylvania, frankly, is to cheat on the ballots. That's the way I look at
it. If it comes to it, making a call on a contested election could turn into real chaos. Why? Well, because counting the votes and deciding electoral disputes is all done by Democrats or Republicans.
There's really no institution in the United States that you can turn to and say, well, this is a neutral institution and therefore we can respect the neutrality and objectivity of their decision-making.
In places like Taiwan, South Africa, Mexico, and India, there are independent commissions that basically help settle electoral disputes.
In other nations, we've sent in the UN to actually observe their elections. It baffles me as to why the UN isn't coming in to monitor our elections.
The UN may not be coming, but 30 international election observers from the world's largest regional security organization came to the US in late September to monitor the presidential elections. But what does it mean that the US lacks a national election commission? In swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, where there is a Democratic governor and Republican legislature, it would be up to a deeply divided Congress to decide which presidential candidate gets electoral votes. So if there is no independent commission to oversee and decide a contested election, what are some of the scenarios that the country could face? Scenario 1. President Trump declares himself the winner on November 3rd as mail-in votes are still being counted. 80 million Americans are expected to vote by mail. That's 2 times more than in 2016. But it's Joe Biden's supporters who may have to wait longer for their votes to be counted. Polls in key states like Pennsylvania predict that Biden would win a mail-in vote, while President Trump would win an in-person vote.
As the mail-in ballots start to shift the lead away from Trump and towards Biden, President Trump would then try to dismiss those mail-in ballots as simply contaminated with fraud and corruption.
So we have to be very careful with the ballots. The ballots, that's a whole big scam.
The votes must be counted between Election Day on November 3rd and Inauguration Day on January 20th. But it's up to the 50 different states to decide how they count votes. You see, there is no uniform system across the US. In 43 states and the District of Columbia, voters, a losing candidate, or a third party can petition for a vote recount. And in 21 states and DC, votes are recounted automatically if the difference in totals is below 1%. States have until January 6th to send the tallies in. But vote counting is likely to be slowed down because the USPS General Postmaster, who FYI is also a Trump mega-donor, ordered the removal of hundreds of mail sorting machines.
In a sense, if you try to delay the delivery of mail-in ballots, that is a form of voter suppression.
Professor Greer says that in swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, Black people face obstacles for having their votes counted.
And because we have zip code data based on race, there are many ways that certain postal services that primarily would serve, say, an African-American community, presumably a more big D Democratic community, those are the postal services that are largely being targeted for defunding or even dismantling machines.
Any declaration of victory by Trump before all mail-in votes are counted is probably going to get a lot of pushback from the Biden campaign and its supporters. And this is where the highest court in the land comes in. Scenario 2. The Supreme Court gets involved. This is what happened in the famously contested election of Gore versus Bush.
Our country has been through a long and trying period, with the outcome of the presidential election not finalized for longer than any of us could ever imagine.
Initially, Democratic candidate Al Gore won the popular vote. But neither Bush nor Gore got enough electoral votes for the presidency. Everything hinged on Florida. Ballots had names on both sides, and some were only partially punched. So this caused so much confusion, they had to be recounted.
What do we want? Count our votes! When do we want it? Now!
Then, 35 days after Election Day, the Supreme Court stopped the Florida vote recount and handed the victory to Bush.
Even people who thought that the Supreme Court's decision was maybe highly partisan and perhaps even poorly reasoned thought, well, at least the Supreme Court brought closure to this election disputes. I really think it was Al Gore, the Democratic candidate for the presidency, who brought closure and not the Supreme Court, because it was Gore who graciously conceded on the day after the Supreme Court rendered its decision.
Let there be no doubt. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it.
I think if you put Donald Trump in the position of Al Gore in the year 2000, there's no doubt that we would have had a full-fledged electoral crisis at that time. So I don't think we can necessarily look to the Supreme Court as our savior in an electoral dispute.
6 weeks before the 2020 election day, a new battle took center stage. President Trump jumped at the opportunity to nominate a new Supreme Court justice after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
I think this will end up in the Supreme Court, and I think it's very important that we have 9 justices.
If the 9th SCOTUS seat had been left unoccupied and the election ended up in the court, there could have been a 4-4 tie. But the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett means that 6 out of 9 judges are conservative and have been appointed by Republicans. Some say Barrett's confirmation is the president's way to secure a swing vote in the heart of a campaign season. And this opens up another scenario for a contested election. Scenario 3. What if Joe Biden refuses to accept the election results? Experts say that Biden might refuse to concede if President Trump declares victory while votes are still being counted.
If it is the case that it looks like President Trump really has been reelected, I assume that Joe Biden will accept that result. And I do think he is a real institutionalist who deeply believes in the norms of constitutional democracy, something which, unfortunately, I don't believe we can say about President Trump.
So if there's no independent body to oversee election results, and Congress is deeply partisan, who can American voters appeal to if they believe the election is unfair? Mass mobilization might be a way. In Belarus, thousands stood against what they said are manipulated election results that gave the country's authoritarian leader his 6th term in office. So what about the US? Any effort to reform the way elections are handled in the US needs to address the country's systemic problems, like, for example, the inherent inequality of the Electoral College, or that Supreme Court judges appointed by the Senate get to influence policy for generations.
We've made lots of progress, but we clearly are not anywhere near the ideal of democracy. And we're at a real division in this nation where many people want to go backwards and others want to go forward. This election, in many ways, will decide which direction we go as a nation.